Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, so we are recording this on March 26th to give a little context since everyone's situation is rapidly changing with the coronavirus situation. And also as a little bit of context, I am in Chicago. Luke is in Barcelona and John is in Denver. So we each are in slightly different situations as far as rules and regulations and government situations as far as what you can and can't do. Illinois has been on a shelter-in-place order since this last weekend, and bars and restaurants have been closed for about 10 days. We closed South Loop Strength and Conditioning in alignment with the recommendations for bars and restaurants. So we've been out of the gym for almost 2 weeks at this point. What are your situations with that?
In Barcelona, gyms started closing 2 weeks ago today. And that was sort of by their own admission. And then the Spanish government put in place the sort of lockdown rules. And that was two weekends ago. So we're nearly 2 weeks into this. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the main differences that Spain has compared to other countries is that you aren't allowed to go outside for exercise. So I do realize that people have the ability to go out and run and all that type of thing. But it's pretty strict here, and it's progressively got stricter. And you can see that with just the sort of the stories of people getting fined by the police. Whereas in the first few days, it was like, don't do this. And now it's, okay, you have to pay €200. So yeah.
Yeah, for me, we got issued a shelter in place for Denver yesterday. No. Tuesday evening, and the gym has been closed since last Tuesday. So I think we're about 10 days in now from the gym being closed. Only supposed to be outside for essential work or getting groceries, and that's pretty much it. I believe you're allowed to exercise if you're by yourself outside. So if you want to go for a run, but then you still have to do the whole 6 feet away from other people if you run past other people.
Sure. So yeah, just sort of a framework for where we're at right now. And don't want to necessarily turn this into another COVID-19 discussion. But I think it is important to sort of set the tone for where we're at and then sort of use that to guide our discussion for today. And so it seems sort of crass, right, in the face of a pandemic that's potentially claiming the lives of a huge number of people, disrupting businesses, causing all kinds of economic anxiety, et cetera, to be like, oh, I'm super worried about my training. But a lot of people are. So we're going to actually dig into some of the actual implications for training for folks. And one of the most common questions that I've seen from people, and not even necessarily questions, but just sort of maybe some neurotic behavior that starts to show up, is related to the question of whether or not I'm going to lose all my gains if I'm out of the gym, right? We've talked about this before in less trying times of people being afraid of, taking a day off or resting or not going as hard as they can every single day, and that they're worried that they're going to actually not get better as quickly as they think they should be, that they're going to lose some of the fitness that they've gained. And in a situation where most people are not allowed to actually go to the gym, right? That people are potentially trying to make do at home with, a dumbbell that isn't the right weight for them, and doing some walking lunges. People are like, am I going to actually just lose everything that I've gained over the last months, years, whatever of training? And, I know I've had a bunch of conversations with some athletes who I coach about this. We've been talking about this with people at the community in South Loop from, different classes we've been doing online and different workshops we've been doing. But I figured that's a pretty worthwhile discussion to have, just to give some people a framework for how to think about, what training adaptations persist, which ones are they potentially going to lose? Do they need to be worried about it? What do you guys think?
I'm pretty excited for it. Obviously, everyone is going to lose all their gains. From a competition standpoint, the Matt Frazier dynasty is going to be over. So it's kind of back into a blank slate for next season, because we'll really get to see who can build back up to that top level again. I'm excited for my own opportunity to get to the games next season. Because really, everyone's starting at square one. I think I've got a shot. So.
I agree, John.
Yeah. I'm in agreement there. I think everyone is going to lose their gains. I think, seriously speaking, I've had this conversation with a lot of people. Everyone is going to probably come out of this period of time less fit than they went into it. If you don't have access to the same means of training, it's obvious that there's going to be a decline in fitness. But I think the fact that if you've already established that level of fitness and those skills and those certain training qualities, then they will be quick to come back as well. So as much as people are afraid to lose them, it's not necessarily sort of in black and white. You're going to have to do exactly the same amount of work to get that stuff back. I think one of the things that people will probably experience is their sensitivity to training and just sort of the discomfort associated with some of the more metabolic pieces of training. And as well as that, just finding, certain things like barbells heavier and metcons and this type of stuff. But that type of stuff does tend to pass fairly quickly. I think the easiest way to explain this would be sort of thinking about if you went on holiday and you took 2 weeks off of training, or you took 2 weeks off of just doing bodyweight workouts on the beach, and then all of a sudden you get back into the gym, how did that feel? It's probably going to have a similar feeling. And I think obviously depending on what people's sort of commitment is to competition, there's obviously going to be a bit of a gradient with that. Some people are going to experience it more than other people, especially if they are very used to, training all of the time, being really regimented in it, and then all of a sudden going to nothing. Whereas if, say, for instance, you just do classes and you do 60 minutes of training per day, and it's fairly varied, and, the focus is on basically maintaining your health and being active, and it's not necessarily on competition, you're probably going to find that the sort of the fitness will come back a bit sooner.
A guideline I normally use for my athletes if they've been sick or on vacation is half the time you were off to get back to where you were. So it's a pretty rough thing, but like if you have 2 weeks just without training, it's going to take you about a week of training to get back up to speed of, how heavy weights feel or how conditioning feels. And that's on the understanding that you're not really doing anything. So for most people, they're not going from training, 4, 5, 6 days a week to doing nothing. They're going from 4, 5, 6 days of training to the same number of training days, but just with maybe less loading or less volume. And the drop off for people is probably going to be a lot less than they're worried about in most cases.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there's different types of things that can drop off, right? So as we often do in this podcast, right, the way to think about this isn't just in terms of like a linear fitness variable that is just going to drop rapidly with altered training. There's a lot of different things that actually go into how quote unquote fit you are. And so I think it's important to kind of break out what people are potentially going to lose and what people are not going to lose as much. So Luke, to your point, just about the sort of feeling of getting your ass kicked by a workout, if you don't do hard stuff that messes you up for a little while, you very quickly lose the ability to do that. And I think a lot of that is not even necessarily the actual physiology of what your body can and can't do. It's not like you're losing, the ability to push hard or anything like that. I think that a lot of it is actually you're losing I don't want to say psychological adaptation because I don't think that's quite right, but sort of like the callousing of pain signals that enables you to push through a challenging situation, right? So I think I've used this analogy before, potentially on this podcast, but for people who have taken some time off and they come back to the gym and they try to hook grip a barbell, it's super, super painful and they kind of can't do it. Right. I know this has happened to me where, you take 10 days off and you come back and you're like, I can't hook grip. This is so awful. And, similarly to people who have potentially done any sort of combat sport, if you haven't punched anything in a while and then you punch something, you're like, this hurts so much that there's sort of like a conditioning that you have to put your body through to get it used to doing something sort of painful like that. And some of it is actually going to be the structures and the tissues being able to handle specific types of stress or whatever, right? The same way you'd get like calluses on your fingers from playing guitar. There's going to be actual bony changes to loading or striking or something like that. But a lot of it is actually going to be the brain's parsing of pain signals, right? That you're going to get these nociceptive signals from that tissue saying something is going wrong here. And if you've been doing something difficult for a while, your brain sort of learns that that's not something that it needs to react to, and it just kind of filters it out, right? It takes in the signal and says, okay, this is fine. We can actually handle this. And I think a lot of the adaptation to doing really difficult, uncomfortable conditioning is very similar to that you get a lot of these fatigue signals of like, okay, we're overheating. Okay, we're losing the ability to contract as hard. Our blood pH is potentially changing. And you do need to keep all of these things within a pretty tight range in order to just like exist as an alive person. But a lot of the fatigue that people feel, I think, comes from the brain sort of shutting down the ability to push hard once it starts to get a certain amount of fatigue signaling. And the adaptation to training comes from sort of like blunting that shutdown response related to how much fatigue you're actually experiencing. So you're able to quote unquote push through more because the sort of subconscious shutdown measures are relaxed a little bit. And so when you don't do hard stuff, you lose that ability very quickly. But that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means that once you start doing hard stuff again, that it will actually, come back relatively quickly, the same way that the calluses on your fingers come back relatively quickly if you start playing guitar again, or just like the pain response that you experience from trying to play guitar when you haven't for a little while. Again, that just sort of gets filtered out.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a lot of different scenarios that exist in competitive fitness and in CrossFit in general that are just really, you're like, it's just not possible to replicate that training in your own home. Even if you have access to, barbell and certain pieces of equipment, likelihood is that you're not going to be able to throw around a heavy, do multiple power cleans with 225 on the barbell, with rope climbs and all of these things. So you're going to have a lot of different things that your body's going to have to try to get used to. And I think that it's about having time in that so that you can sort of, you can blunt that sensitivity. But as well as that, there's lots of things that people can do now at the moment to sort of, I wouldn't say that you can still be challenged. And I think that one of the things that people are challenged by is the fact that they don't necessarily have things that are really difficult to do, or things that they have to really apply themselves to day in, day out. I think doing a bunch of air squats and push-ups in your living room is an easy way for people to express fitness, and that's the reason why people are doing it a fair amount. But it's going to get to a point where like there might be some other things that you want to try out. It might be pivoting and doing some more gymnastic strengthening work, which is really, really difficult, and focusing on that and sort of going through that challenge and going through something that is just not easy for you. I think that there's an element there that can actually allow people just to make that transition a bit easier going back into regular fitness, because there's obviously certain things that you're going to feel rusty with. And, you hear of sort of sports people talking about all the time, when they come back from, say, like an off-season period, they'll talk about, okay, I lost my edge, or I lost this, or whatever it was. And it actually takes just getting back into it and doing the activity repeatedly, and also exposing yourself in different scenarios as well. But one of the things that I think I've sort of noticed is that you have a lot of people that they worry about losing their fitness because they're constantly sort of comparing themselves to others, and it's usually those people who are worried about that, and then there are those people who don't necessarily compare themselves to others as much and are probably a little bit more intrinsically motivated. There doesn't tend to be this sort of similar worry that they're going to lose all their gains. And for those people who are, and they are comparing themselves, most people are in a similar situation as well. So there's sort of like as John was saying, there's a clean slate at the end of this that we can all take advantage of. And, you know, it's going to be, the barbell's going to feel heavy for you. It's going to feel heavy for everyone else. And you know, a lot of people have to go through this. You know, what is really interesting is you see that in certain sports, for instance, I know in the UK, the England Rugby Football Union, they closed the season completely, and the season still has, I think, 3 or 4 months to go until the end, but they just completely cut it off. And you have like professional sports teams that are losing, I think, 25% of their pay over in the UK at the moment through this whole thing because of the season's ended. But there's opportunity in that as well, because the people have sort of said that they're looking forward to having a bit more time to focus on pre-season. They're going to be a bit more rested. I think one of the issues that you find a lot in CrossFit is that, you know, the sort of desire to compete and always having a competition on your calendar in sort of close view does cause people to overwork themselves and not necessarily have as long a career in the sport as they could do if they were taking off more time. And I think that this sort of forced period of rest could actually give people a little bit more motivation to take that time off in the future, so that when they can sort of think about this in terms of like, okay, where do I want to be in 3 years, 5 years time, as opposed to I need to qualify for this next competition and then it's the next qualifier and then it's the next qualifier. And I've personally got stuck in that loop and it's exhausting. But yeah, I think the sort of the forced rest will be actually good for people. Especially if you have little niggling injuries that you're trying to get a little bit more of a handle on.
I think that forced rest in the CrossFit setting is going to be useful for the top athletes, but probably worse for the like on the cusp athletes. Just because there's no real information about what's going to happen. No one really knows where the season's going to go. Like, Granite Games just announced yesterday that they're not doing Granite Games this year. You know, no one really knows if there's going to be any more sanctionals at all this year, or if there are any this year, they might be after the games. We don't even know if the games is going to happen. Like, you have to think that it's probably going to go ahead, given that it's scheduled for the last week of July. So we're April, May, June, like 4 months away. You'd expect it to go ahead, but there's a chance it doesn't. So for a lot of those athletes that were like wanting to go to a sanctional in whatever capacity, whether they're like a top athlete or just wanting their chance to kind of go there and compete, they actually don't know what to do from that aspect. You know, it's not a case of, oh, we've got some time that we can kind of take off and relax. It's, well, there might be a sanctional in 2 months and I need to be ready for it.
Yeah, true. I agree with you there. I think if someone is trying to break into a certain level of competition, or if, say, for instance, the opportunity for them to compete at sanctionals or, you know, other competitions that they're trying to get into, if it's not as clear cut and it's not as I'm not going to say guaranteed, but if the chances are lower, it's obviously a lot more stressful for those people than it is for those people who, you know, are pretty not guaranteed but a spot, but the chances are higher for them having spots at the competitions they want to compete in. And I think that exists on the sort of games level, sanctionals level, and it probably exists as well, you know, with local competitions that are just, you know, just outside of that sanctional division. If it is
Luke, you mentioned some variance in the psychological response of folks to having their training pretty severely altered. Can you just dive into that more and give a range of like what you're seeing and how you're responding to that as a coach?
Well, were you talking about like their motivations and their worries around that, or were you talking about like how they can make shifts, or what I was mentioning there?
Yeah, more just their their response, like their motivations, how you're seeing some people adapt and some people not adapt.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So, I mean, well, some of the clients that I'm currently working with, they've actually not had a gym for like 3 weeks. So the sort of the change in the shift in their training has had to happen very like, it's been going on for a little bit longer. So some of them, some people quite often what ended up happening was that during the period of readjustment, people were just sort of, doing random stuff. They were just wanting to try stuff out and they were just trying to figure everything out. And then I think after a while of that readjustment, usually about a week into it, it starts to be, questions are asked of, okay, well, what's the direction now? And where are we going with this? And okay, will I lose my gains? And am I going to lose fitness from this? And those people that tend to worry about, worry about their placings in competitions, compare themselves a lot to each other, to other athletes and their sort of peer athletes, the ones that, tend to have stresses based on the fact that they've seen other people do this and they're doing this, or whatever it is. There is a worry of sort of like losing fitness generally with those people. But then for those people who tend to be just a little bit more, okay, it is what it is, and I do this because I really like it, and I'm learning and growing from the experience all the time. And I would probably say that that's a more I wouldn't say that there's a perfect mindset for someone competing in the sport of fitness, but I do think that being able to detach yourself away from all of the noise and all of the comparisons that exist on social media and stuff is very, very useful, especially if you want to compete for a long time in the sport. For those people, the tendency is being like, all right, well, what are we going to do now? And it's just a little bit more of, okay, well, there's a job to be done. Let's get on with it. And it's, there's been some people would have been like, okay, well, I don't know how to do this, or I can't do this certain gymnastics movement as well as I should be able to, or as I want to be able to. Now I'm not snatching, a couple of times a week, and now I'm not doing this, that, and the other. Let's focus on that. Let's do that. So that's been really good, and that's been quite refreshing. But I mean, the sort of conversations I've been having with people, and I have pretty much spoken and connected with all of my clients since this has gone on is okay, we need to shift our focus, big sort of priority on try and sort of to develop just a consistent training routine, because I know that some people, their sort of daily routine exists around their training. And then now, for a lot of people, this weekend I made a real conscious effort to do certain things that I do on the weekend and to change up my daily routine just so that I knew it was Saturday and Sunday. And that's been really important for people. So and as well as that, trying to make people shift and focus on things that are actually quite a bit harder, it's sort of, okay, well, let's be, there's obviously a certain level of competence that you need in gymnastics positions in CrossFit, but there's also this element of sport specificity where you're trying to, balance what you would consider sort of virtuosity within the movement, but then also their ability to express it in the sport. I've been a little bit more like, okay, well, we're probably going to take a little bit of a stricter stance on your ability to hold certain shapes in your gymnastics, and getting people to do nasty stuff like accumulating 5 minutes of wolf facing handstand holds, perfect positions, like literally just getting people to but getting people to have a real challenging time with certain elements of their training which they're not used to. And it's been, I think I've definitely had to make it a bit of a diversion in terms of some of the stuff that I do program for people, and I've been looking at different stuff just to make sure that there are still things that people can do. Even just sort of like focused mobility work, getting people to actually work on increasing end ranges and doing that actively, and not getting them to sort of deal with cramping up their hip flexors when they're trying to hold certain stretches and all this type of thing. It's it's been interesting to sort of see some of the feedback from people when they actually have been changing up their training.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, sort of like you mentioned, that people are going to have a varied response to having their routine altered to being in sort of like a crisis type of situation, et cetera. And, something that might be helpful for people to think about is just that there's sort of like a fundamental personality trait that is going to impact how different that response is. So not to dig too far into it, but if you think about the ways that people vary, right, that there's all kinds of models, but the big five model of personality is one that is reasonably accepted in a lot of different psychological literature. And there's these 5 factors that people are different across. And a lot of people have done something like the Enneagram or the DISC profile or a Myers-Briggs or something like that. And those are all kind of like fake pseudoscientific versions of the Big Five test, which is more generally accepted, as far as I can tell, as a non-expert in psychology. And one of those traits is something called neuroticism, which doesn't really mean what it means in sort of like colloquial usage, right? It's not just like, oh, that person's neurotic or whatever. One can sort of define it as a sensitivity to negative emotion. Right, meaning that people who are high in the trait neuroticism are potentially going to experience more negative emotion related to anxious feelings, to depressive feelings, to feeling negative social comparison, all that kind of stuff. And just even recognizing that you may sit somewhere different than someone else on that might be helpful. It doesn't necessarily give you like a specific action to take, but in something like, a pandemic that's shutting down businesses across the world and infecting people and making you sort of afraid to go outside, that some people are going to experience that much, much, much worse than other people, simply based upon their kind of like fundamental personality traits. And that carries over to training too. So if you know that you are someone who does tend to get more anxious, who does tend to get more wrapped up in social comparison, who does tend to get more depressed about things that are kind of out of your control, that, it's not enough to just be like, oh, well, you need to figure it out. It's like, okay, I might have a certain sensitivity to this type of thing that not everyone has, and this is going to affect me more. And it's not necessarily your fault, right? There is plenty of stuff that you can do about it. But if you are someone who is more affected by that, it might be helpful just to recognize like, okay, this is sort of a fundamental aspect of my personality that I can't necessarily change, but I might be able to actually change my response to it and try to think about sort of like you said, Luke, what can I actually control? What can I work on? What can I focus on? And realize that, you might feel worse than someone else. You might not realize like, well, how can these other people just kind of like, just keep going about their business and be content to do rowing intervals and push-ups, and I'm freaking out over here. But you may experience that emotion more than someone else, but it doesn't mean that you have to kind of feed into it and sort of spiral down that road of comparison and, worrying that everything is for naught. And why did you even bother training when everything is canceled, et cetera?
Yeah, I think there's great value in sort of having that level of awareness, and then also people are sort of forced into a period of introspection right now. And I think, if people are becoming very anxious about their training and the sort of things that they potentially are going to be losing and things like that, I think that it can be very, very valuable for their training out beyond this, when they do have access to certain things that they don't have access to right now, when things do, when gyms start to open and everything like that, I think it would be, very useful to understand some of the thoughts and behaviors that you were having during this period, and sort of seeing how that you can better your experience in your training outside of this when things normalize.
So I think that it's going to be, like you said, people are going to lose a lot of the high end, high power output CrossFit-y type of stuff. That's going to go away. A lot of people aren't going to be able to do that in their homes, which we didn't even really talk about, but simply based upon the movement selection that they have available. If you're trying to train in an apartment in a major urban environment, you're not going to be able to do thrusters and pull-ups, right? You're not going to be able to do high rep, moderate load power cleans and bar facing burpees. You're going to be stuck with jumping switch lunges and push-ups, and you might have like a 40-pound dumbbell that has like a weird handle on it or something. So that's going to certainly change what you can and can't do. But in terms of practical recommendations, right, I think we just need to accept, okay, we're going to potentially lose some of that high-end power output stuff. We're not going to be able to train that, like we said before, it's not necessarily going to go away fully once you just kind of reintegrate that type of training into your plan. You're going to regain a lot of those abilities relatively quickly, since I think a lot of it is just kind of like we said before, sort of callousing that fatigue sensitivity. But in terms of what people can work on, there's these positional things that we talked about. And I think there's a lot of other stuff that is actually something that can be trained, that can be improved when you have suboptimal equipment selection and, not a lot of ability to do a lot of the stuff you would be doing in the gym, right? I mean, one of those things is just like the ability to have capacity in certain types of movements from a muscle endurance and conditioning perspective, right? A lot of what we've talked about in previous episodes has to do with like, how do you actually make stuff sustainable? Well, if you have maybe an erg in your place and a dumbbell and you can do some push-ups, like you can actually do a lot of work in terms of creating mild aerobic fatigue and then moving into muscle endurance sets, which is something that a lot of people really, really need to get better at the sport of CrossFit, that they need to get better at doing potentially 200 shoulder-based contractions when they can't breathe very well and are having a hard time pumping blood around their body. And there's a great opportunity to do that with, rowing 500 meters and going into very high rep sets of moderate load dumbbell push presses.
I think one thing that people have to be careful for is going to come down for how long, people are out of the gym for. Because a lot of the movements and equipment that lend themselves to at-home training are kind of unbalanced. You think about people doing all these like burpees and push-ups, but really with less ability to do upper body pulling work. So whether that's pull-ups or rows or things like that, a lot of squat-based work without much hip hinge or pulling from the ground work. And I think if that's for a couple of weeks, sure, it's not going to make a huge difference. If that's for a month, 6 weeks, people might start to see negative effects of that, and might have to either get a little more creative with their training or just try and do some corrective exercise around those movements to either avoid injury or to avoid just becoming very imbalanced.
Yeah, I've
John,
been.
That's a good point.
Yeah, there was one of the sort of initial concerns I had is with sort of just making sure that people still have some balance to their training. A couple of things I've been prescribing is a lot more sort of partner assisted glute ham raises or Nordic curls. So just like the focusing on the negative portion. There's also what they call the Harrop curl, which is another form of sort of hamstring exercise, but they're very much more sort of prehab style exercises that are used a lot in the strength and conditioning world for prepping people for sprinting. But I've been using that a lot, and then also the sort of the table body weight row. For me personally, I've just been making things a lot harder by either pre-fatiguing work by just going through stuff and just to make it more, just to seem harder. But as well as that, just adding in isometrics as much as possible. So, on the table that I have, it's very hard for me to do a body weight row where I'm using a lot of my own body weight. So I just finish every set with a max hold. And it's just trying to sort of like create, there's a lot of creativity that I think people are having to sort of get into. Yesterday, because I've mentioned before, but a couple of months ago I started doing jiu-jitsu, and I was like, okay, I'm going to lose my grip strength. But yesterday I realized that the 10 kilo hex dumbbell, if I held each end of it and I was basically putting my hands around the rubber part of it, it actually turned into a great grip exercise. So it's interesting. It's just there's a bit of, I think, randomness that you might need to allow into your training if you don't have it programmed by a coach or anything like that. Because I found that over the last 2 weeks that just doing that, I've actually found some useful training tools which I wouldn't even expect. I was literally just playing around with it and thinking, okay, how can I make this harder? All right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But it's just trying to find those sort of places that you can make things a little bit more difficult. But I think, yeah, the balance aspect is something that was something that I was fairly worried about, but there is definitely opportunity to be developing, especially if you have a piece of aerobic equipment. That's one of the things I wish I had. But there's definitely the ability to work on some stuff with that, which I think that everyone needs a little bit of. It's not really, not very many people are excluded from that group. There's always a way that you can utilize that.
Yeah, totally. That in terms of opportunities, right? Probably the biggest things that people are going to be able to work on is going to be, like we talked about, this sort of aerobic muscle endurance sets, depending on what they have available. Some prehab/rehab types of exercises, meaning some of the isometric holds that you're talking about, Luke, as well as a lot of positional and breathing types of drills that people might know they quote unquote should be doing, but don't necessarily always do because they want to do thrusters and double unders instead. And then some creativity in terms of exercise selection, as well as skill work on certain types of things that they might have access to, right? Like, handstand positional drills, all that stuff. So that's where the opportunities lie. And I think that as soon as you accept, okay, this is the type of stuff that I'm going to lose, but I'm not as fragile as I think in terms of losing all of my aerobic capacity and strength and skill in different movements, that a lot of that will come back quickly once I start to train it again. It's about focusing in on the stuff that you can actually improve based upon what you have available. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.